Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 1, Part 2.2, Our Family Tree, read by Natalia Buzova. Now, I will continue the pedigree with the sons and daughters of grandfather Grigori and grandmother Sophia, that is, my uncles and aunts, as well as their sons and daughters. The eldest son in the family was Uncle Andrei, born in 1892. In the photo, you can see my uncles standing, that is Andrei, my father Ivan, and Petro. And those who are sitting, they are Himka, Maxim, Alexei, and Ksenia. The photo was taken in 1939. When he grew up, his father sent him to Odessa to study carpentry. This once again confirms that there were some relatives in the line of the Turk grandfather's mother. In the photo, you can see a postcard sent by Andrei to his cousin Ivan to Odessa. And it was on the 13th of October, 1910. In Odessa, Uncle Andrei studied and worked for several years and returned home, as my mother recalled, a handsome, urban-style young man. But World War II began, 1914-1918, and he was drafted into the army and then sent to the front. Many disasters befell him, but death, which mercilessly mowed down the soldiers, still passed him by. When the revolution broke out, Uncle Andrei was elected a member of the Soldiers' Committee, saw and listened to Kalinin's speech. The regiment consisted mainly of Ukrainians and was about to support the Central Rada. Then the Bolshevik Kalinin jumped on the rostrum. At first, he was not listened to, was whistled. People shouted, "Get away." Then he knelt down and began to assert warmly that he was a peasant like them. And he got attention. And then he spoke in such a way that after him, no one was listened to. And part of the regiment followed the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik word, saturated with Lenin's decree on land, had such magical power. Unfortunately, that decree played only the role of a sweet gingerbread, which the peasant never managed to taste properly. Later, in the hands of Stalin, the decree became the trap in which millions of peasants found themselves. Socialist-type serfdom with prisons and camps was prepared for them. In 1918, Uncle Andrei returned home, got married, and began to work. He married Uliana Trotsakivna. Her father, Mihail Fedos, Trotsak nickname in the street, was a slightly eccentric man. According to the old-timers, he liked to drink and then make noise, to play a comedy on people about which the whole village would talk for a long time. One day, it occurred to him that he would soon die. Knowing that at funerals and memorial services people would drink a glass of alcohol and he would not, he decided to hold a memorial service at his lifetime. He made a coffin to his liking and invited his closest friends to a funeral service. They immediately had, with their red noses, what it smelled like, and did not make him wait long. They entered the house, and there in the middle of the house there was a coffin, and in it, with his arms crossed on his chest, lay the doomed servant of God, Fedos. They brought him down, seated him at the table, and the memorial service began. And when the beer with honey was gone, they went from house to house and drank the last glass for the servant of the god Fedos. After those memorial services, grandfather Trotsak lived for 8 years. And then, giving his soul to God, he went straight to paradise. Now he is there, apparently snorting vodka and snacking on lard. and he laughs that we, the earthly righteous, will not get to those shining peaks behind which everything will be on coupons or there will be nothing. Uncle Andrei and Aunt Uliana built a house near the realm and grew a small garden. They had the best varieties of apples, pears, plums, apricots, and cherries. There was also an apiary. They always kept a lot of geese and ducks on the farm, as pasture and water were nearby. My uncle worked as a carpenter on a collective farm all his life. He was reticent in public, listened more to what others were saying, and could only occasionally add something of himself. I don't know how it was in the family, but from the outside, it seemed that the ubiquitous Aunt Uliana was in charge of everything. She was an energetic and penetrating hostess. Unfortunately, her health was slightly undermined and perhaps shortened by the sudden misfortune that befell her in the 1930s, before the war. Leaving the collective farm place of work, she unsuccessfully jumped out of the lorry, was caught by the side hook, and tore the belly. Aunt Juliana was also straightforward, frank, and talkative. If something was true, then she would not be silent. No matter how authoritative Uncle Peter was, he was afraid of Aunt Juliana. Uncle Andrei died at the age of 78, going to the collective farm workshop almost until his last day. And 3 months later, Uliana passed away. They raised 4 children, Natasha, Dunya, Ivan, and Kostya. The eldest was Natasha, born in 1920. Before the war, she graduated from Lochwitzer Teacher Training College and became a primary school teacher. In 1942, she married Ivan Petrovich Shostak. After the war, they left Yashniki for Volyn, for the village of Metelno. Natasha worked there all her life as a teacher, and Ivan Petrovich held the position of accountant of the collective farm. In those years, I also taught in the neighboring village of Lichane and often visited them. They also visited us. If there were more guests, Ivan Petrovich took the mandolin in his hands and I took the balalaika, and we played and the guests danced. In 1965, Ivan Petrovich fell ill and died. Natasha remained with her 2 sons, Grigory and Leonid. I will tell you something about the elder Grigory, born in 1943. I remembered such a life situation. One day, all the uncles and relatives from Dmitricha came to Uncle Andrei for the temple holiday. It was in 1946 or 1947. The families then had this order: if there were guests in the house or just strangers, the children should not be nearby. In winter, their place was on the oven, and in summer, outside. We undressed. Uncle Peter looked behind the oven, and there Grisha hid. He was then 3 years old. In the hands, he had a chicken leg and meat in the mouth. He chewed quickly, swallowed, and looked warily. "Give me some meat too," Uncle Peter said to him, frowning. "It's not meat," Grisha answered, and hastily gnawed what was left. And what if the angry grandfather would take it away? "And what do you have in your hand?" Uncle asked. "A bone," the kid said confidently, showing a bare bone and licking his lips. At the last words of the little one, the guests laughed in unison, and Uncle Peter, smiling, added, "That's cunning, Sheshenko." Grigory studied well, and after graduating from high school, decided not to go anywhere but directly to Moscow University. Indeed, as my relative Ivan Andreevich Romanenko said, modern youth want to take the position not below a minister. He meant my son Volodymyr, who boasted to him that he would enter the higher aviation engineering school. And in those years, there was a strong agitation on the part of the party bodies that graduates of rural schools should remain in collective farms. or enter agricultural educational institutions. Grigory did not enter Moscow University. I don't know what was missing there. Apparently, nomenclature weight. He had to go through labor universities first to gain work experience, which gave the right to benefits when entering universities. He worked for some time in a brickyard where he quickly realized that kneading clay is much harder than dealing with the book. Although he returned home tired, he still found time not for football, but for textbooks. At that time, I worked as a school principal. There was a shortage of teachers with higher education, and I took him as a teacher of physics and mathematics in grades 5, 8. For 2 years, he taught and deepened his knowledge, and trying the third time, he entered the Kyiv Polytechnic Institute, after which he worked as an engineer, a secretary of the Komsomol committee, and now head of the plant, Kyiv Electroprilad. Grigory married the daughter of my young friend, Mikhailo Dmitrovich Solonucha, Lida, who graduated from the Institute of Foreign Languages. At first, Lida did not have a residence permit in Kyiv, so she could not get a job as a teacher and began working in the design office of the same plant where her husband was an engineer. She still works there. They have 2 daughters, Oksana, a student at the Institute of Foreign Languages, and Lilia, a high school student. They live in Borshagivka in Tupikov Street. Natasha's youngest son, Leonid, graduated from high school and driver's courses and then the army. He served in Germany and drove a general. After military service, he remained there and worked as a driver at the Soviet embassy. Then he returned to the Union and drove the first secretary of the Central Committee of the LCLYU, and now drives a tourist bus on international routes. His wife, Vera, works in trade. They have a daughter, Julia, a student of the 4th grade, excellent student. They live in Troyeshina in Balzac Street. The second daughter of Uncle Andriy and Aunt Uliana was Dunya, born in 1922. Before the war, she graduated from Lochvitsa Medical School, but never became a nurse. The war and the German occupation began. And then a long illness took hold, rheumatism and tuberculosis of the bone in the leg. She was treated for a long time, wherever her uncle Andriy didn't take her. Once, with great difficulty, he got a ticket to the resort in Odessa. The times were post-war hard and hungry, and when he returned, he said, "When I saw how many fat gentlemen were lying on the beaches, my heart ached. We work so hard and starve, and they live like in paradise." Yet Dunya was cured. Only her leg almost did not bend at the knee. She began working as an accountant on a dairy farm and then a saleswoman in the village shop. She married Mikhailo Chepurko. They lived in Korolkiv hamlet for 20 years. And when Dunya's parents died, they moved to Yashniki. They both worked on the farm. They raised 2 sons and a daughter. Mykola, the eldest son, graduated from a vocational school and works as an electrician in Donbass. And his younger son extracts oil somewhere in Siberia. And daughter Hala stayed with her parents, graduated from high school and telephone courses. She works in the Lochvitsa post office. Hala has a son, Vitaly. Among the sons of Uncle Andriy, the eldest was Ivan, born in 1924. During the occupation, he was taken to Germany. After the war, he served in the army. After demobilization, he worked almost all the time on a collective farm. And for the last 20 years, he was the head of the farm. He was a hard worker, for which he was repeatedly awarded orders and medals. His wife, Uliana Matviyenko, was for some time the secretary of the village council, assistant accountant of the collective farm, and in recent years the cook in the collective farm canteen. They built a good house in the ancient Shevchenko's yard near Bondarivshina and lived there. But Ivan died prematurely in 1987. He had lung cancer. Their only daughter, Halia, graduated from the institute and works as a technologist at a distillery. She has a school-age daughter, Luda. Uncle Andrey's second son was Kost, born in 1927. Black-haired, slender, and handsome. For some time, he worked in the mines of Donbass and then as a driver in Kremenchuk. There, he and his wife Zoya built a house. Their two sons passed away early. The third one, Viktor, works in Mykolaiv at a plant. The second son of grandfather Grigory and grandmother Sofia was Uncle Peter, born in 1894. In his younger years, he was in science with a tailor from Lochvita. He learned to sew men's and women's clothes well. His girls' corsets turned out to be especially beautiful. When the First World War began, he was drafted into the army and after some time sent to the front. He served in the infantry, took part in battles including the Brusilov breakthrough, and then was taken prisoner. He worked there at the slaughterhouse and lived well. After the revolution, he returned home and no longer served in the Whites or Reds. He married Kisils Palashka, and they lived first in the house of his uncle Yevdokim and later built their own one. Uncle Peters cultivated the land and worked as a tailor. But in the 30s, collectivization began and he entered the collective farm. He stopped sewing clothes because now Stalinist laws were issued, according to which the district finance department could fine and tax private tailors, shoemakers and coopers with such a tax that you would be left without pence. Uncle Peter was probably the best beekeeper in the village. In his garden were always at least 20 hives. The smart state did not allow people to keep more. For many years, he also cared for the collective farm apiary. In addition, he was also an excellent fisherman, had different gear, knew where to fish, when, and how to fish. During the Stalinist years, honey and fish to some extent saved his family from starvation. All the uncles, as well as us, their children, loved to visit Uncle Peter Petro because there would definitely be fried fish and honey. On the feast of Petro and Pavlo, which was his birthday, he called us to himself and treated us to fresh honey. The village and district authorities also liked to turn up for fish and honey. And my uncle entertained various chiefs so that they would not be too picky about his fishing. It was necessary, as they say, to put a candle to both God and devil. Otherwise, you would not survive. I must say that Uncle Petro was considered the most authoritative among the brothers, their recognized leader, and his house was the unifying center of the Shevchenkos, in whose soul the Cossack past always burnt. Before the war, I rarely visited Uncle Petro, maybe 3-4 times a year, and when they sent me from home for something, and we lived in different corners. Our parents communicated more often, and we naked sat at home during those hungry years. And when we grew up, we flew to study, some to Lochvitsa and some to Poltava. My rapprochement with Uncle Petro began after the war. Perhaps at first it was due to the fact that my father, the only brother, had died at the front. And later, something mutually attractive arose in our souls. Being a bit drunk, he spoke with pain and anger about the yoke of Moscow. He knew well not from books, but from the stories of parents and grandparents deprived and offended Ukrainian history. His dear guests were such Ukrainophiles as the old teacher Semen Ivanovich Gres, the cousin Orishka's husband from the Mitchicha, Vasil Minovich Boyko, who had served 10 years in Stalin's camps, and a certain Pashchenko from Lochvitsa, whose father had been a member of the Central Rada in 1917-1918. I happened to be in their company several times. They were wise people, enriched by life experience and respected by all who knew them closely. They talked to me about the pain with restraint. Although my uncle remarked that I was the one to be trusted, I, in turn, had already tasted the bitter poison from Stalin's bowl. I had fought, had been severely wounded in captivity, suffered there for about 3 years, and returned home barely alive. And I would have been in Stalin's camps after Hitler's camps. But I was saved by the frontal disability. However, I was still considered an unreliable element. I was not given any work except for ordinary collective farm work. The feeling of being guilty without guilt, when for your blood and torment they throw a stone at you, depressed and outraged me, produced the appropriate mental resistance, and by nature I was inquisitive and vital. Besides, the years of war and captivity were tragic for me, but at the same time a great school of life. In such circumstances, I reached for the origins of the plight of the Ukrainian people, both in the bosom of the Russian Empire and the Stalinist dictatorship. In 1946, I accidentally came across Mikhailo Grushevsky's History of Ukraine. I saw it at Mikhailo Grigorovich Galivets, Klunak, and asked to read it. It literally plowed me all over. This was the real, not falsified by Moscow, history of Ukraine Rus from ancient times until 1918. There could be only one thing for reading such a book, prison, but I read it with great interest. What was written in the book coincided with the stories of Uncle Petro. That's the way our rapprochement went on. We sometimes talked at our table for a long time, and I noticed how pleasantly impressed he was by my knowledge of the history of Ukraine. From him I learned the most about the past of our village and our pedigree. We went to the temple in the Mechicha together. In addition, I sang well and I knew a lot of old songs. Celebrating the temple holiday or Christmas, the uncles went from house to house together and took me with them instead of my father. They drank a second glass and then turned to me. Well, Ivan, start. And I sang. Throw Peter the wife and I the husband, and let's go to Ukraine, where it's fun to live. Uncles and our Dmitricha relatives amicably joined. They were not marked by special voices, but sang with inspiration, with soul. They sang Cossack and household songs. Oh, noise, mother, noise. Oh, the reapers are on the mountain. A Cossack went to war. Oh, woe to that seagull. Snow got whitened, whitened, white. Once in Kiev at the market, unharness boys' horses. When I get up on Monday, at the request of Uncle Petro, I sang some songs myself. Those where a sycamore stands above the water. A boat floats without an oar. I saw the wind break the birch. The wind is very loud in the field. Listening, he was very moved and hid moistened eyes under shaggy eyebrows. And when one day Pashchenko from Lokhvitsa, who had a wonderful baritone, and I sang the song, and for 200 years a Cossacks in captivity, Uncle Peter could not stand it and cried. I quote this song in full. Its text was written by the poet Anatoly Svidnitsky on the eve of the bicentennial of Ukraine's accession to Russia. He then taught in Lubny, and the music was written by the composer Nizhomkivsky. And for 200 years, a Cossacks in captivity. He walks over the Dnieper and asks the fate, hey, fate, get out of the water. Free me, sweetheart, from trouble. I will not go out, Cossack. I will not go out, Falcon, because you know very well how hard it is in captivity. Hey, in captivity, under the yoke, under the Moscow guard in prison. Oh, Mr. Bogdan, foolish son, you ruined Poland and also our Ukraine. Hey, ruined, destroyed, because you had little brain in your head. The song sounds strong and scary, like an anthem, like an oath, like an immortal Cossack spirit, enslaved but not conquered. I can only draw one conclusion from this. No matter how internationalist Russification is imposed, no matter how many executed and tortured people have been sacrificed to it, the sense of national dignity in the Ukrainian people will live forever because it is immortal. My uncle died at the age of 77. There are two daughters left, Marusia and Halia, as well as the son Anatoly. The girls were beautiful, of exceptional kindness and cordiality, friendly and talkative. There were differences between them. Marusia is blonde, more like her father, prone to prudence in conversation, and Halia is black-haired and beautiful as if she is drawn. Her eyebrows are laced and she's more emotional and cheerful. Marusia graduated from pedagogical school before the war, but did not have time to teach as the Germans came to the village. She was then just 19 years old. Later, she taught for more than 30 years in the Lviv region, and after retirement, she returned to the village and bought a house. Halia graduated from medical school before the war, but did not work in her specialty as the German occupation began. And after that, there was no working place in her village. In 1946, she married a village paramedic who later hired her as a nurse at the medical center. They were probably my closest relatives during my entire stay in Yashniki. They lived together well, in abundance and harmony. At the age of 57, Halia developed a serious illness, cancer, and she died. Uncle Petro's son Anatoly, born in 1942, continues our pedigree in Kremenchuk. He went there with his wife Catherine in the 70s. Anatoly works as an electric welder and Katya works as an accountant. They live well. Anatoly does not drink alcohol or smoke, has his own car. They have two daughters, Zoya and Tamara. Zoya is studying at the Pedagogical Institute and Tamara is in high school. The third son of grandfather Grigory and grandmother Sophia was my father, Ivan Grigorovich Pavlenko, born in 1895. I will tell you about him shortly.